I'm Fanny Surjányi, Head of Research at MCC, and I will be your Master of Ceremony for tonight. We will focus tonight on the future of warfare, which has inevitably arrived at our doorstep, with those international experts who were kind enough to accept our invitation. If you post on social media, please use hashtag MCC Budapest Lectures. For those who need it, you can find interpreter devices at the registration desk. Please return it at the end. Hopefully, all of our speakers recovered from jet lag and their tiresome journey, because at this point, I will call you one by one to take your seat on the stage. First, Mr. Daniel Cohen, who is the Head of Strategy and Intelligence Program at the Abba Eban Institute of International Diplomacy, the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, Israel. Please, Mr. Cohen, come and take your seat. Our second speaker is Mr. Oliver Lewis, who is the co-founder of Rebellion Defense, led major efforts in reforming how the UK government prepares for emerging technology. Please, Mr. Lewis. Third speaker is retired Vice Admiral Duncan Potts, who is Director Maritime, Training and Education at Universal Defense and Security Solutions. Please, Admiral Duncan, come and take your seat. And last but not least, the moderator of the discussion will be Dr. David Kriekemans, a Senior Associate Fellow at Egmont Institute, the Belgian Royal Institute for International Relations, and Professor of International Relations at the University of Antwerp. Dr. Kriekemans, I pass the microphone to you.
Thank you. And the microphone is working. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation by MCC Budapest Lectures. The future of warfare has come, ladies and gentlemen. So either we are now in the future or the future has come to us. We will see. Von Clausewitz once said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. War has always been part of mankind, ladies and gentlemen, whether we like it or not, but it has shifted over time, both in form, in intensity, in the actors that played a role in it, and we will all investigate this evening. There are also many variables that will influence warfare. These could be geopolitical variables, the changing world, for instance, the rise of China, or Russia being very active once again on the regional scene, perhaps also global scene, sociological developments, non-state actors that enter the scene, economical threats. We are now in an age of, very much geo-economic tensions that might also translate into, actually crises, regional crises. And of course, also there is the technological dimension, and all these variables, I would say, interact with one another. The speakers have already been introduced, ladies and gentlemen. What we will do this evening is first, we've agreed that we are on a first term basis this evening. We will do a first round where each of the speakers will briefly talk about their views on the so-called transformation of warfare. In the literature you sometimes read the fourth generation of warfare, but I looked it up. It's already since 1980 that term has been used. And later on we will move to other topics such as hybrid warfare, but also the role of technology, how technology plays into that. And we have two eminent speakers, an entrepreneur and also a person very much into the new phenomenon of hybrid warfare, but also cybersecurity, terrorism and counterterrorism. And we'll end the evening talking about how nation states should deal with these challenges. And of course, if there's time left, we will do Q&A. But first, may I say, Duncan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to join you this evening. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. I think the issue behind the four topics this evening is very much the future of warfare has come. Well, self-evidently, to my mind, this is not true. The future is the future, and to a greater or lesser extent will always be unknown. Also, we've fallen into this trap before at the end of the Cold War. That famous paper of The End of History was written, and I think that we now recognize that the world had not embraced liberal pluralism, and we had singly failed to understand the competing issues in the world. However, what is equally true is that the fourth industrial revolution is fundamentally altering the way that nations, businesses, movements, interest groups, and individual people interact on what I call that sliding scale of cooperation, competition, confrontation, and conflicts in some form of oscillating continuum. So as David mentioned, Clausewitz and war as an extension of politics by other means, yes, that holds true, but that rather binary distinction between war and peace is not part of the world in which we live today. Now, Russia is often credited with developing and practicing this next generation or hybrid or grey zone warfare, which I think was neatly characterized by Yanis Berzins of the Latvian Military Academy, a country right on the edge of seeing this. And he described it as a shift from direct annihilation of opponents to its inner decay. From war with conventional forces to irregular groupings, from direct clash to contactless war, from the physical environment to the human consciousness, and from war in a defined period to a state of permanent war as the natural condition of national life. I don't disagree with this characterization, but is it the only toolkit that's available? I think it's easy in the world today to think that propaganda and subversion are new. They are not. But what is new is the exponential expansion in the means to deliver it that are enabled by the information and digital age. Historically, using the instrument of war was the preserve of governments and elites. Now, leadership of and access to these tools have been opened up to the people. Moreover, throughout history, governments and militaries have controlled the adoption of new capabilities. Indeed, they were often the catalysts for technological innovation that was subsequently adopted by wider society and commerce. What has changed in the information arms race is that it is being led by the commercial sector, is relatively cheap, and is more easily and quickly adopted by non-state actors, and those states that are less inclined to be constrained by the norms of international law and behavior. I'm often told as well that in the age of grey zone and hybrid warfare, this has made traditional military hardware, such as ships, tanks, aircraft, rather redundant. I think this is exaggerated, and to quote Mark Twain's comment that reports of my death are greatly exaggerated rather rings true. The physical domain will remain a key tool, especially in confrontations and conflicts between nations. But that domain will continue to change. Autonomy, nanotechnology, biomedical science, hypersonic missiles, direct energy weapons, some of these are going to be the same changes to conventional warfare as the sail to steam revolution at sea and the horse to tank on the land. Equally, we have tended to start our force planning by looking through the lens of the traditional domains of the land, the sea, and the air. And we have tended to view things such as space, communications, command and control, and information as mere enablers for the physical. I think that the time to invert that is upon us now. The kinetic domain will undoubtedly remain important and in many cases decisive. Ask the people of Aleppo. But I suspect that time is right, in the broadest definition, to start constructing your defense, starting with effects and information, and construct your capabilities around that. And perhaps we can get more into that in question. So, drawing these together, I don't think the future of warfare has come. Yes, much of what we currently describe as the future is in fact happening today. However, we would be unwise to think that this is some form of new status quo. It's worth remembering that the world before the World Wide Web, but that was only launched to the public on the 6th of August 1991, only 28 years ago, 2 years after the end of the Cold War. And in fact, 28 years is usually less than the lifetime of a warship or a combat aircraft. So all this has happened extremely quickly. So even the known unknowns about the future, what artificial intelligence or quantum can bring, will have a profound effect on us. And I can guarantee there will be lots of Rumfeldian unknown unknowns to trip us up in the fairly near term. Thank you very much.
Oliver Lewis.
Thank you. I think one of the rather frustrating characteristics of the contemporary character of war is it's the most complicated to understand that it ever has been. So that's the bad news. The good news being that it's as complicated and difficult to understand for our enemies as it is for our friends. But the way in which I think it's quite useful to think about three of the trends is by using three elements from popular culture. So I'm going to tell one story around Star Trek, one story around Star Wars, and one story about the recent series of Netflix's The Crown. And we'll start off with The Crown. So there's an episode in the latest series where Lord Mountbatten, who's this terribly grand admiral of the fleet who led an operational theatre during the Second World War, and he's asked by a collection of very wealthy bankers and business people in London whether he would lead a coup against the left-wing Labour administration of Harold Wilson. And he goes away and he spends a lot of time thinking about, is this viable, should I do it? Britain is in terrible decline, we've devalued the pound, something needs to change. And he, like a good military man, he spends a lot of time planning and thinking about this. And then he invites these business people down to his country estate and then gives them a presentation and says, all of the successful coups of the last few years have these characteristics. However, even if I were to marshal 10,000 soldiers to take Parliament, to capture the Prime Minister, a coup in Britain simply would not work because of the maturity of the institutions. That the bureaucracy is too old and laden with history, that people respect the judiciary and the courts too much, that the free press would rally around this aversion to democracy, and that people in the end would not tolerate a coup. Now the point here is that a lot of the wealthy, well-developed Western states with very high-tech militaries have extremely mature bureaucracies that are laden down with history. We have extremely mature checks and balances of the free press, of the judiciary, of, in many cases, even the church playing a moral voice. And therefore, all of these institutions create a form of societal resilience that actually makes a lot of Western democracies very well guarded against the type of information war that we're most petrified about. So domestically, we're quite well protected. The rather frustrating irony in that is that the very conditions, so a well-functioning bureaucracy that takes a long time to plan, the very conditions that make us resilient against information war make us really, really terrible at practicing information war against our enemies. So if you think of how planning cycles work within militaries, it takes a very long time. If you think about the Ministry of Defense, there are thousands of people spending a lot of time thinking about something before a single plan or a single strategy can be devised. We have politicians who have their own interests. So we are not innovative or nimble of foot in implementing new technologies, in implementing new doctrines or tactics or even strategies to further our national interest. So we're really bad at information warfare. The second one with Star Wars is, if you think of in The Last Jedi, one of the recent ones, Finn and Rosa, who are two of the characters, they travel to this very wealthy world where there's a casino where all the wealthiest people in the galaxy spend all their money, and it's very gratuitous. And they're trying to convince a hacker to help them with something that they need to solve. But one of the things they observe is that there are lots of arms dealers in this casino, and they see an image that the arms dealers they're funding the First Order, so they're funding the bad guys. They're responsible for building the TIE fighters and all of the evil technology that's being used. And then very quickly, it also is pointed out that these very same arms dealers are also building the weapons for the resistance. It's exactly the same technology is being used against them as they are using against their enemies. And that's when it comes to both anti-ballistic missile or ballistic missile systems, or when it comes to information warfare, our enemies are using the exact same technologies that we are. Now, the United States used to have an idea of a strategic offset, which was based on technical superiority over one's immediate enemies. No single state now has a strategic offset based on technology. And not only does that mean that it's quite difficult to have an aircraft carrier floating around the South China Sea and also have it outside of the attack zone of mainland Chinese ballistic missile systems, it also means that there's a level of interdependence in the supply chain which would make it very difficult to go to full-on conventional war without, for instance, the F-35 fighter jet having a lot of supply chain dependencies on a large number of Chinese companies. So the United States' most advanced fighter jet is reliant on Chinese companies and technologies, let alone the independence of the global economy. And then the final one with Star Trek. In the original series, there's an episode called A Taste of Armageddon, where the Enterprise arrives on a planet, and it becomes apparent that this planet used to have really devastating wars, lots of death and destruction. And they decided, okay, this type of warfare with another planet is too destructive, so we're going to simulate war, and every simulated attack, when it's successful, the simulation says, okay, I've dropped a missile here, 100,000 people have died. So the 100,000 people in that area line up and are euthanized. So they are killed by the state, because that's seen as a less destructive form of war. So it's simulated effectively software-based warfare. Now, when it comes to information warfare, we're pretty close to that already. So we have a level of software-enabled conflict ongoing right now, which, different to the Star Trek episode, is largely invisible to us. So we're becoming alienated from the consequences and the experiences of conflict. One of the most dangerous things about being alienated from the consequences of conflict is that when your sons, daughters, brothers, fathers are not going to be put in harm's way on the battlefield, it's actually much easier to escalate conflict. It would be much easier for us to say, as indeed we've started to theorize, can we use information warfare, can we use software-enabled warfare to start to have an impact in the physical world? Can we destroy energy infrastructure? Can we figure out a way to kill someone solely using a software chain? It's a fairly realistic possibility. But the moment we step across that threshold, we open the possibility of rapid escalation toward conventional war without ever really meaning to.
Thank you. Daniel Cohen.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I will start by saying that I thought that the Brits, I suppose, is the best on information warfare between the Western countries. So what does it mean for all of the rest of us? That kind of a quote from you. I will focus on the technological side, a bit of teasers about the response, but I will leave it maybe later on for the discussion. I would like to analyze a bit the current trends, or maybe the future trends, risks and threats. And I will start with the revolution of G5 technology from one side, mix it with AI, add a bit of quantum computing, and now take it to the cybersecurity world and think what other possibilities. And by saying that, I will say that the strong are getting stronger, meaning the leading countries in the field of cybersecurity and development of technologies are becoming much stronger than the others. Saying that, also the weak are getting stronger. I think that we had a couple of examples just we heard now from the two gentlemen sitting next to me. I will say that there is a conflict between some of the technologies that are being developed. Take, for example, there's a huge debate today about developing of face recognition for law enforcement. Now take it to the other side, verse it with deep fake, for example, and what are the possibilities there? Take IoT, every little machine that each one of us has on its home. Now take the ability to use it as a botnet network to disrupt or interfere political campaigns, or use it as cognitive ops against elections, for example. Everything relates. We see a development, I think you exactly were on that point of the developing of offensive cyber weapons by the democratic countries. But first of all, let's see if we can understand a bit the other side, the rivals. And I will say that we don't understand them, and we keep being surprised each time because of that. Last year there was a new huge development. There was a Poseidon leak on Telegram of data that came from Iranian APT-34. It's a cyber unit of the Iranians using it mainly against government, academic institutes, critical infrastructure around the world. Now it's been revealed by actually by the Brits, by the British Cyber Bureau and the GCHQ, that actually it was a Russian cyber unit called Toller Group that hacked into the Iranian group, took their own codes, pretended to be the Iranians, and used it for their own attacks. And I think that this is something that surprised many of the cyber experts around the world. And what is going on the other side? So we see an evolution that started with soft power tools like naming shaming, meaning we can't attribute cyber attacks to anyone, but we know that you are behind it, so we publicly will blame you for that attack. Didn't work. So mainly I'm speaking about American strategies and American Cyber Command. They took it further on and said, okay, we have this active cyber defense, meaning I can use defense for offense. Let's create a Cold War tool called the hack back. Someone is attacking me, I will automatically attack him back. Didn't create any deterrence. So now we see something really interesting called defending forward. Anyone that is a football fan and looked on Barcelona, not now, but at least a couple of years ago, knows that they like to pressure on the other side. They pressure the defense of the other side, and they call it defending forward, meaning take the conflict and try to use it against the other side on its own territory, even if it's a cyber territory. Now this is exactly the gray zone, meaning develop offensive cyber weapons, use it against the other side in its own territory, and here, meaning it can also get maybe the potential of physical attack. We didn't see it yet, but we're starting to see it. We saw it in the conflict between US and the Iranians recently, using cyber tools and not kinetic tools after they were being attacked. And I think that most, if I need to frame it, we've seen the development of attacks without crossing the threshold of armed conflict, but we need to see where the line goes. if our rivals are always like building this red line, deciding that they want to get to a point, but then make these 10 pink lines and always take another step towards it, and we don't have the bridges to do so. So when we develop attacks or weapons or technology that doesn't cross the line, we need to define for ourselves, first of all, where is that line that we want to act in the beneath the level of war. I think we leave the floor for later on for discussion on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. So we see parts of that old world still here, but things are definitely changing. The technological advances are there as well. What kind of conflicts can we imagine in the future? Who are the enemies, and what are the stakes? Are the stakes political, just like in the Cold War era, or are they economical? Is this actually, you could say, it's a world of economic warfare? There are some economic interests we need to address, and then. A point that I take from you is, well, in the Cold War, it seemed that, well, there were definitely conflicts, but they were all proxy conflicts to a certain degree. And, well, although interests were defended, the politicians knew very well that, well, the ultimate sacrifice could not be made because nuclear weapons were there not to be used. Are we living in a different world? A world where offense is the best defense? Point to that.
Probably two things. The first one being that in responding or mounting a type of conflict now, the mechanisms that we have that devise and implement the strategy set up around 19th century bureaucratic means to produce perhaps a single universal geostrategic priority and then cascading strategic or operational priorities, that doesn't work anymore because the type of enemies and the type of attacks are now so great in number and so different in characteristic. And it's that is one of the defining problems, is that a type of strategy to push against China in the information space would be attempting to counter intellectual property theft, whereas the type of information strategy against Russia would be attempting to counter or stop interference in domestic social media. Both of those would require different mechanisms, let alone then if you're thinking about responding on a counterterrorism campaign using special forces that are then deployed into another state, where you need a lot of the conventional mechanisms around strategy making to still be in place. So we can't any longer just have a single planning process to produce the necessary result. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks. I think a really good question. I grew up and came of age during the Cold War, and we thought that was the natural state of things and it would endure forever. And it's only since it's ended that I think we can now look at it quite clearly and say it could be characterized, it was very complicated, but it wasn't complex at all. We knew a lot about the Soviet Union, they knew a lot about NATO, there were rules, there were regulations, there were mechanisms in place. So it was quite a simple game to play. I absolutely agree with the characterization that has gone in here. I think almost everything that we do in terms of threats is sui generis, in that everything is slightly different because of the players you're looking at. And therefore, one of the great risks that I think the West can have is that we tend to clutch at solutions. We say, I know what this is happening, this is the toolbox I'm going to go for. And yet actually it needs some really deep analysis, because there are many more tools available, which has been touched upon, especially in the information age. We have an interconnectedness and a dependency around the world. So you may actually do yourself some more harm. what is deterrence? What are the tools of deterrence against the range of players? And it's too simple. I hear it all the time. People, even today, clump the behavior of, say, Russia and China together. But they're completely different. They're different countries. They've got different tools available to them. And they need to be treated very differently. But actually, in both those, and it's not that because I'm an old fella who used to drive ships around, I'm advocating, but they have a military arm and a strong kinetic capability, and are using some of these capabilities to deliver them into really effective anti-access aerial denial capabilities, which means you don't have to invest much to overmatch an opponent that has got to come to you. But my enduring thought is really this deterrence thing. How do we deter? And we've just heard, you know, from Daniel over there, some of the problems in the cyber domain and everything.
Completely agree. We see military use of power against diplomatic and economical targets, mainly. We don't see each of the actors that was mentioned, also the terror organization, it's not only the countries that were mentioned, mainly hurting us in our economical stomach and not going against our military capabilities, because we still have the relative advantage. There's still some kind of asymmetric there. Of course, they are developing also kinetic tools or kinetic weapons. I can give you an example from the Israeli perspective. It's not the Cold War, of course, it's not the same, but we do see proxies developing kinetic weapons against us, aiming against us as a kind of deterrence. So we won't act against them in a case of escalation, and each escalation you see like a very precise use of kinetic powers. So even from them we see mainly information warfare style of conduct of war and less kinetically.
Is it then still possible to, well, we had these doctrines in the Cold War, how to engage with the enemy, but now it seems that we sometimes do not really know who the enemy is. What is then the doctrine? And another question linked to that, what about civilian oversight? Because this seems to be, well, there are professionals here. What about our politicians? Is there then some oversight, or do these things go so far and so fast, for instance in terms of cyber warfare, that you need to have a permanent command that responds, that acts on behalf of the civilian authorities? Perhaps.
Great question. In cyber, this is exactly the problem, the lack of expertise in the decision-making process. So what we see is strategy that supposedly it needs to be developed by the decision makers, but actually being developed by the commanders in field. Cyber commands that are huge now, progressing in all countries in Europe and in other places like US and also in Israel. Policy level where it needs to be implemented, still we see it in the same hands and power of the cyber commands. There's no like any civil understanding of how it needs to be done because lack of expertise. I think that the game changer actually was the elections in the United States in 2016, where everybody understood that something needs to be done. And since then, we see a huge debate regarding the use and the developed and the policy and the strategy and also the methods being used in the cybersecurity world, mainly cyber defense, but also I mentioned the cyber offense. We see more debate now because of that also in the UN level and international entities, but the main core is still in the hands of cyber commands.
I think it would be interesting to ask Duncan something in a moment, because one of the things, having just left the British Civil Service about 6 months ago, one of the things we were trying to do was to encourage or even try and mandate that our most senior officials should have quite a well-developed understanding of technology, and that not to do so was now a failure in their responsibility as professionals. But I know from a military perspective that there's always been a level of frustration with, say, even people like me on the civilian side, let alone parliamentarians or politicians, not having a strong enough grasp of military strategy. So now we're in a situation where not only do these politicians not understand military strategy, they also don't understand the technology. So it's becoming even more frustrating with a lot of these people. And then when we think of speed of command and control, particularly in cyber war, but frankly in a lot of conventional warfare, which is now using autonomous systems, the speed of decision-making needs to be based on the speed of data flow and not the speed of the human mind. So we've moved beyond the point at which human genius is the answer. So now, if we want effective civilian oversight or effective command and control, we need technologies to augment human decision-making. We need to be asked to make the single most important decision, frankly, by a piece of software, because we cannot make all of the possible decisions. It's beyond our capacity.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to comment. I'd like to go back to the first word you use, which of course is always one that gets us military folk excited, which is doctrine. Yeah. And a lot of people, to my mind, misinterpret what doctrine is. The simple way to describe it is doctrine is what you're taught, but it will always need judgment in application. And it goes back to my previous point that almost everything we do in the world now is not I've seen X, Y, and Z, therefore I can look in the book and do A, B, C, and we will win. I think it's so much more complicated than that, complex than that we can't do it. But, I mean, to reassure that doctrine for the model world, doctrine is something that's dynamic, and I know for the UK, I used to own our doctrine centre, so I know, there are lots of people working at that all the time. But I'd also say, to counter a lot of the threats we're talking about here, this is not a job for just that one part of government called the military. This is a whole of nation response, and it's not just those institutions that are directly owned and controlled. It needs a national effort to do this. So yes, it's the military, yes, it's other government departments, but it's also your commercial base, it's your citizenry and everyone else. And people say, but that's impossible in the modern world. But we have done it in the past. And you could look back to the Second World War when the whole nation was mobilized. And in fact, many of the things that we're doing in terms of, with the tools we had available then, in terms of information operations, subversion, and everything else all went on there. But we had got ourselves to a position where there was a universal consensus of the threat that was faced. I don't think that exists in our Western societies. It's held amongst those that study it and look at it, but it doesn't affect necessarily the everyday life of someone on the ground. So I would say that. The other one, of course, is some of the things to be able to use. One of the things that we stand for in our countries is the rule of law, and it goes back to the points that Oliver was making earlier when talking about this putative coup in the 1960s, that most of us live in countries where the institutions and the willingness of the people to support those institutions is stronger than the maverick political leader or someone else can take it elsewhere. That isn't in the rest of the world. What is undoubtedly right is that, right in the meaning of the word true here, is that it makes us more vulnerable because others who don't care for those rules can do things to us. And that's non-state actors, but some states as well. But we've got to, there is no alternative, we've got to find a way through this because we are democratically accountable. We do live in countries where there's an open press, and we've got to find a way through this. And that is really, to my mind, where the real challenge lies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Just because something that, Duncan, you mentioned liberal pluralism earlier. I think when it comes to this type of unpalatable decision, what we're going to increasingly have to ask our citizens to consider is that when it comes to the theory of liberal pluralism, Isaiah Berlin, the 20th century philosopher, wrote about this quite eloquently, that the question will often become, if you wish to pursue freedom, you do so at the expense of security. If you wish to pursue another liberal aim, you do so at the cost of another liberal aim. You cannot simultaneously become the most liberal democratic society by hitting all the values that you like, however nice it would be. So the question, if we want to get better at this sort of warfare, will come down to what are all of you willing to compromise on in order to defend the core of democracy? What really convenient or comfortable or important liberal values will you give up in order to maintain, say, democratic capitalism rather than authoritarian capitalism on the world stage?
Yeah, sorry, and that can happen overnight. We all say a threat is a combination of capability and intent. And capability takes a long time to establish, and intent can change overnight. But we've seen that in recent times, and I'd cite, the United States, that when we were going through the times of the Balkans, the impact of, what's now known as Black Hawk Down in Somalia, was causing, we don't want American people to die overseas, bring them back when a very low threshold was hit. But a couple of planes into the World Trade Center switched a nation's approach overnight because it felt, it was such a cataclysmic event, and that could happen, potentially to us on this continent. And it's a fact. It may happen, but I can guarantee it will change lots of our views along the lines that Oliver says.
Yeah, I want to continue from here. I think that what we saw after 9/11 is collaboration, first of all, between agencies that started to share information. Actually, in the cybersecurity, where Britain has clusters, for example, of collaboration between different sectors. And I have one practical example of the online war against ISIS. If in the beginning we saw DOD doing its own stuff on the covert side and the State Department running its own campaigns against ISIS so people won't get recruited to ISIS, and counter-narrative campaigns on Facebook and social media, they both understand that there's a way to collaborate and find a way for collaboration, because if there's a hybrid warfare from one side, you can build a hybrid model from the other side that will take relative advantage of each of the sectors, for example, government, intelligence gathering, covert operations, cybersecurity, G2G, government to government, and so on. You have the private sector in this big data revolution of technologies that is being developed and can be used for the same, to counter the same threats. And you have the civil society, academic world of knowledge, and also can be a platform between civil society or civil society to government, but it can also be the one that can connect the bridge between the private sector and the governmental sector. So what we saw with the Americans, that after they didn't collaborate between them, once they started to do so, they built a new platform of engagement, of a network that combines academic, data science, for example, or network science that wasn't there before, also private companies, but also government that was really involved there. And then they started to see the difference in the online war against ISIS by decreasing the number of ISIS use of accounts, of course, with collaboration with companies from the Silicon Valley. But they also find and develop new tools to counter the narratives of the other side and find ways to the distribution of this kind of content that they didn't have it in before.
Well, I gather that we need a kind of whole nation response, if you will. Whole nations, in the sense that it's not limited to the Ministry of Defense, Minister of the Interior, it's also economic affairs, etc. But then I wonder around which sense of urgency. For my country, for instance, the sense of urgency was the 22nd of March 2016, the terrorist attacks in Belgium. So that was the sense of urgency, and still it reverberates in the country. If something happens, people go back to that feeling. So my question being, around which sense of urgency could you then organize a whole nation response? And a second follow-up question, and then we move further. What you were saying earlier, Oliver, that fine line between defending liberal pluralism and, well, taking away some freedom, where is the line? Because, for instance, you could refer to the terrorist attacks on 9/11 in the United States. Well, pretty soon afterwards, the Patriot Acts were voted upon, and some people at least believed that some of their liberties were taken away. So, where does that fine line lie, according to you?
I can. Yeah. Actually, I think the Patriot Act, and I think the response to Edward Snowden's leaking, and the response in the UK to the question of the suspension of habeas corpus and indeterminate temporary imprisonment, are all really great examples of how the type of thriving democratic society does issue a corrective. Like, for the whole point being that people stood up and said, this is wrong, you've gone too far, and the mechanisms were largely in place for the people to exercise a change on that. And it becomes sort of even more important to then have civilian oversight of the intelligence agencies, to have judicial oversight of intelligence agencies, the same with the military. And I think those are broadly positive stories of a corrective. That's why we engage within the fight of democracy, is order to say, I think you're wrong for these reasons, and let's have a pretty punchy fight about it.
Russia's attack was a game changer. If I remember right, Facebook collaborated with the prosecutors in Belgium, but Yahoo didn't. And actually, one of the attackers had a Yahoo account, and they didn't want to share the information. Created a huge change. I think the EU found new tools to pressure Silicon Valley companies, especially after Bataclan. It's not only the case in Belgium. And I believe that today, we need also check and balances for those kind of companies, and not only the law enforcement and the agencies that are collecting information about all of us. And there we didn't find yet the silver lining how to do so, because it won't come from the governments. Maybe we'll have Edward Snowden that will come from Facebook and like reveal everything like we saw with Cambridge Analytics. But remember, we still also need to look on that side, and the privacy issue here goes also to the private sector, not only to the governmental sector.
Just a quick thing on the tech company side, in that I agree with you that they are rather challenging and allowed to get away with quite a lot. And then if we think of them on a spectrum of how our states interact with the private sector, at one end of the spectrum you have, say, the Russian state, which has effectively strangled the private sector. It's admitted that there's effectively no startup ecosystem. It doesn't have an innovative technology community. Then in the middle, you have China's approach to the private sector, which is to broadly let it flourish, but occasionally say, no, here's a national interest that you, Alibaba, or you, Tencent, need to get behind and push. And they have legal mechanisms now to do that. And then the British and American approach, which is do whatever the hell you like. Occasionally we'll realize we'll need your help, and you'll resist us in the courts, or you'll resist us as much as you can. And I think the British and American perspective or approach has led to the only important thing for those technology companies to be the return of shareholder value, and no interest or no obligations to return value to a broad democratic stakeholders. And Microsoft's chief executive is one of the few people who has come out and said, we as a company, we have a responsibility in a democracy to get behind and sort of further national interest, just as a company in China might do so.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, going back to I think you started your question, where is the line and how we draw it? I'm afraid, like my other answers, is you don't know where those lines are until events happen. So, you know, classic was the US line to the use of chemical weapons. It had drawn a red line, which of course is a well-known expression, when really it hadn't really in itself drawn the red line there, and actually it became more disastrous by not crossing that line. So where is the line? I think as events unfold, things will change and lines will ebb and flow, and they have done through history as well. I'd also say, looking at our continent here in Europe, we're talking about threats that has been my professional career, and I know are genuine threats that are going on. But I think even if we look in our own continent at the moment, if you live right up on the Russian border, you would most probably see some pretty existential threats. And I'm thinking, you know, some of the smaller Baltic nations there. If you live in right in the south of Europe, you might see that uncontrolled immigration and everything is the biggest threat that you've got. So trying to find an absolute easy consensus amongst collective organizations is quite difficult to do. I would just say, and people often find it's interesting that an ex-military person says this, but you know, you'll often hear people say, and it was said over after 9/11, the ends justify the means, we've got to do this. Well, when you start undermining actually the very nature of who you are as a society by your actions, you may achieve some short-term gain, but actually you're creating long-term problems for yourself that might be even worse. And I think for democracies, that's something that we need to bear in mind.
Thank you very much. Now, another concept also comes to mind when we talk about the future of warfare, or recent events, if you will, which is the concept of hybrid warfare. And when I talk about hybrid warfare, well, I often, Russia comes to mind, of course. The developments in Donetsk, Lugansk, but also how the Russians have almost perfected on the one hand they have the military presence, and that military presence might be denied in certain moments in time, whereas at the same time they use the cyber component. They send mixed signals through diplomacy. They send a signal that they are willing to talk. So in that sense, another dimension of hybrid warfare is that the adversary in this example has many instruments at his disposal and sends, well, conflicting messages, you could say, through those instruments. How to deal with that?
Okay, I'll certainly kick that off. I think I said it in my opening remarks. There's nothing new in this. Hybrid warfare, you know, little green men used to be called proxies in the past. So just looking at my country, we used to have something called the East India Company, which created its whole army out there. When you look around the world, actually, those that have used other people to go and do things with maybe some military advisors along to help them, you know, there's a long history of doing this. So I would almost say there's not much that's genuinely new in this, but you've also got to pick the right conditions in the country for that to be effective. So, you know, when we look at the issue over sort of Crimea and Donbass region and things like that, there were, you know, population and social dynamics that would allow that to sort of flourish. So it's, that side of life isn't universal. The area that has changed exponentially, again, as I said, is the way of messaging many more players there, the speed, the tempo, the reach, the penetration that you can do has been so democratized that it's difficult to control propaganda as people would have imagined in the Second World War or something like that. And I guess you guys are more of an expert on that. So
I'm going to ask a question of you instead, because I agree that hybrid warfare is nothing new, but I wonder if one of the new aspects is that we are now slow to anger, whereas in the past, the types of activities that we're seeing in hybrid warfare would have resulted, for better or I'd probably argue for worse, in a very kinetic armed response. And now we're much more refrained deliberately. And do you think that's accurate or not?
I don't know. I suppose the classic hybrid warfare that people are talking about is, you know, the seizing the opportunity of what was going on in Ukraine to reclaim Crimea, which I've been to, and actually when I was there, I was very struck that to go in and see the Ukrainian fleet, I was, you know, you had to be let in by the Russians. So there was a unique set of circumstances there. I'm just trying to think of other precedences throughout, and are we slow to rile? But before you start intervening, you've got to think about escalation, and it's not as simply a function. And we do suffer from this a little bit in the West, is there'll be a media storm. It may be stirred by, you know, a headline on the news that night, and it's usually children badly killed, and there's a sort of public sense of something must be done. And it's easy to leap to do something, but you've really got to think through the second, third, fourth, fifth stage of what might happen with that. And so there are circumstances where you might just need to accept it because you haven't got the strength and the resolve in your institution to do anything about it. And that's a function of life, and that's a calculus of relations between people as well.
I see it a bit different. I think it's more than just proxy war or use of this little green man to fight wars somewhere. I believe that what we're seeing is actually a fifth domain, cognitive or human behavioral domain, if the fourth is space. And cyber is the one that supports all of them, meaning cyber supports them in the way that when there is a conflict or armed conflict, it will disrupt our ability to understand the reality. And this is what makes it a hybrid warfare, and it's not only how they use it. I believe that technology did change it because of this digitalized world, and especially with the younger generation. Again, going back to Israeli experience, because we do suffer from a lot of threats in our region. We had a couple of years of stabbing and ramming and running over attacks. And after our security agency didn't understand how it's happening, it was all spontaneous. Actually, it's pretty much the same as the lone wolf attacks in Europe by ISIS, but it was much bigger in the numbers. Each day there were attacks on the streets, mainly in friction points in Jerusalem, other places. And at some point there was an understanding that it's not organized or coordinated from above, from any terror organization. It's really spontaneously, and it's happening from the online world, that the youngsters that took part in it, most of them were 17, 18 years old, even 13 years old. And those guys were waking up in the morning, taking a knife from the kitchen and going and stabbing people on the street. And it happened for almost 2 years. And if you look at it from a perspective that says, okay, this is something different, there's a new kind of battlefield that's happening on the street, on the civilian side actually. It's not enough to put soldiers in like corner steps of the streets and to foil it or to stop this kind of attack. It actually means that you need to develop new tools that will counter it on the online world. And when we take it to the online world from the offline world, from our reality, meaning something else is going on. There's something that is happening because it's really part of their arm, this cell phone, for example, that they use each morning. And I think, again, it's pretty much what we saw from at least not the organized attacks like in Brussels or in Paris or other places, but the most spontaneous attacks. This is exactly that. This is a kind of a hybrid warfare that can also be used by state sponsors or by states to do so also. And for now, we saw it only on elections, but it's a tool, it's a powerful weapon that can be used also in other kind of conduct of war.
I think this is a brilliant and important point because it illustrates how these types of attacks are weaponizing consumer technologies. So they are exploiting things that we consume every day for leisure or convenience and gradually manipulating, in many cases, our own elements of our own population to become weapons against us. And that's an extremely difficult thing for us to counter because we would then have to argue that we need to shut down the ability of our public to use social media to decide and determine what they consume when, or to not have the convenience of ordering something immediately from your cell phone. And I don't think we as security practitioners have any idea how to grapple with that.
Give maybe the solution that first of all, they understood that they needed to collaborate between intelligence units, between the police, the other government offices, but also private sector companies. What they did, they built an AI machine learning process. After they understood that a lot of these people that committed the spontaneous terror attack, actually there were crumbs or clues on Facebook and on Twitter that if you understand them, you can stop them in advance. You can't, because we are a democracy, we could not shut down Facebook in cities in the territories, so there was no any kind of cyber warfare. But they did start to analyze from open source, actually, using AI, and building lists of people that have the potential to commit attacks. What they did next was actually pretty simple but clever. Because they were 16, 17 years, 18 years old kids, they picked up the phone to the fathers, told them, look, your son tomorrow is going to attack in the morning, stop him now, because you don't want him to be killed during that attack. A lot of them actually died when they did attack. So that decreased it at some level. Others were questionized by our collaboration with a Palestinian security service. So they stopped them. I have no idea what they did with them, but it also decreased the number. And some of them were warned by a phone call that says, look, relax. There was no, I think, the problem in this case, if I'm analyzing now back, because it was 2 years ago, there was no alternative. It's not like carrots and sticks, so there was no carrot here. It was mainly for deterrence and to stop it. One of the main problems was like in Minority Report, like you can't stop someone from committing a crime that they didn't commit yet. So this kind of prediction models, it was very efficient in its way. I'm not sure that for the next time, if we will see another wave of this kind of attack, it will be enough.
I know you've most probably got a question coming. Can I just one other point here? I absolutely agree that the war is about the human consciousness and the perception, but in some ways it's always been not so much at the individual level, but at the sort of state and elite level. And there's one thing about the quote that I used earlier about Grazing, where he said, what did he say here? He says, a shift from the direct annihilation of the opponent. If you actually look back at history, warfare has rarely been about the annihilation of opponent. Most wars have been about exerting power or control, dominance, conformance, submission, or exploitation on someone else. The other one about the whole social media use there is that, and we've seen this unfolding really over the last 5 years. If we had sat down, certainly 10 years ago, we would have all sat here going, social media is going to be that great globalizing and liberalizing force of the world, because all those parts of the world that can't be penetrated, they will be penetrated by social media. I think as we sit here at the end of 2019, we now know that the nature of the way social media has evolved is that people tend to congregate in communities of like-minded people, and therefore ideas get reinforced. There isn't the challenge out there because people don't talk to people who don't agree with them. They don't allow access themselves to be accessed by those sites. So it becomes a self-reinforcing prejudice out there. And I read a study that had been done the other way about, in particular, people who are semi-professional bloggers and everything, and they found the behavior of those bloggers is that they monitor how they're doing on almost an hour on a daily basis. And if they take a tip, that the metrics they use for success is how many likes and how many retweets there are. And if they go down, one of the reactions of that is to say something more outrageous and more extreme. And the more you do that, the more it gets retweeted and liked. So again, it all becomes a great sort of radicalizing, self-fulfilling thing. You know, there's something deeply ingrained about the human mind and how we behave as humans, tied in with the technology use here, which I think we need to understand a lot better.
I have like a small comment to that. No, I thought about something. This is one of the problems or challenges that we are facing, because we see today a progress on the Western side of creating also cognitive centers or influence operation centers to counter hybrid threats. But a lot of them actually measuring themselves by the number of flags in a quantitative way. And I will argue that we need also to think in a qualitative way, not only quantitative, because this is exactly what the Russians and others are doing. They are micro-targeting their attacks, even if it looks like something that is vast, and it's not only the distribution of the content to many people as they can do so, it's actually very targeted. And especially today, because we see the trend of social media companies, especially Facebook, moving into communities. So now you have communities online on social media, not only your bubble of people that are like you, but also all kinds of communities. And if the Russians will find a way to like infiltrate in those kinds of communities, it will be very challenging and risky, because they are already very specialized on how to micro-target audience.
Thank you very much. So clearly we are living in an age of what I would like to call space-time compression, and the technologies that have an impact, but also the democratization of these technologies, if you will, whereby non-state actors are much more powerful than they were in the past. Let's for a moment delve into the technological dimension, and there's quite a lot. Well, the drones, the robots, and AI. Let's look at drones and robots for a minute. I think there is one policy indeed that Obama inherited from George W. Bush, which was exactly the drone program in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And actually, if you would look at the numbers, Obama used quite a lot the drones. But I would tend to argue that it actually produced terrorism instead of protecting, that it actually, created a kind of fear, if you will. Definitely in certain regions in Afghanistan, and that it was not the measure that some would have hoped it to become. Can we start with that? Is there anyone?
I'm very happy to. Yeah. Talking about the drones and robots and things. I mean, first you go back, and we've had this, you know, on our sort of red top new page, you know, killer drone carries out a strike. Again, I can speak for my country, and I know the United States well. Of course, all those drones, it's a bit of a myth that is played up in some sense that they're somehow completely autonomous decision-making systems. They're not. They are controlled by human beings, and you know that permission to engage is a huge human decision, no less controlled than a pilot in an aircraft. Now, the pilot may be sat in the middle of the desert outside Nevada, in Nevada, a long way away, but it is still. So there's a sort of degree of fallacy. But undoubtedly, the technology now exists to challenge that. Now, we have international laws and norms about that, which we're not applying to. So it is a moral dilemma coming up. The other one I'd say about sort of drones and robots and everything is, and I think actually Oliver touched on this earlier, is in some ways using them, especially in the front line, especially at the times when you're in confrontation, but you haven't tipped over to conflict, it's much easier for these things to be shot down, to destroyed, or do something. And therefore, because there isn't a human in. So if you look at the American drone that was shot down just off the coast of Iraq earlier in this year, if that had been in the old days a manned aircraft up there and it was shot down, we'd be in a fundamentally different place than we are at the moment. So the role of autonomy, and in the front line when the ease of starting the shooting battle is made easier, is something that we as militaries and decision makers need to get our minds around.
I think there are two responses that are, in my mind, perfectly sensible. And the first one being that if you have seen or heard of stories of friends, colleagues, family members, regardless of whether you agree with them or not, being killed instantly like that from something that you can't see, of course you'll be bloody terrified by that prospect. So could the inducement of fear result in people then taking up arms? Possibly. I think it would be difficult to chart the causality of that. And then the other thing that is certainly perfectly sensible is if you want to prosecute a military campaign, why would you not use technologies that will not put your soldiers, sailors, air staff in harm's way? That's, again, perfectly sensible, and I think we'd want that if they were our children's brothers, fathers. But the thing that I think is a cause for concern and needs addressing is that the speed of the weapons system is far in advance of the speed of the analytical system that determines who the target is. So the hardware is now far in advance of the software. So do we have the analytical software with the necessary intelligence sources to know for certain that the person we are targeting is the right bad guy? I suspect sometimes the level of doubt or confusion or mistake will be too high, but that the ability to run the weapon system and prosecute targets regularly is extremely effective. So this is a challenge then to the military to address what is effectively the back office software that then determines who is killed.
I'll just add, not on the ethical side, but actually on the practical side, lesson learned from the last attack of the Iranians against the Saudis. We saw their weapons with low signature, meaning a huge challenge for intelligence to understand from where it came from. There was a lot of disinformation in the beginning. It was a combined attack. It was not only strike drones, but also suicide drones, also cruise missiles all together that really shut down, I don't remember exactly the percentage, but huge percentage of the national oil company of the Saudis, meaning they use, as I mentioned before, military tool, a new kind of operation maybe even, because we didn't see a lot of this kind of operations in the past, that was targeting an economic goal, but also causing a diplomatic crisis because of the understanding of the Iranians, that because that it was beneath the level of war, there's a potentially there won't be any retaliation from the other side, and this is exactly what happened here.
All right. And now we're into technology. Let's take the robots and the AI together. I've heard some calls by some diplomats that we actually need a kind of international legal framework somehow because, well, robotization and AI is already here and there being applied. perhaps in reconnaissance, etc. But it could move into offensive weapons. Is this something we want as humanity, or do we kind of need an international legal framework? And in addition to that, if we even would have it, can it be implemented? Because that's another question.
There's another television program called The Good Place, and one of the characters is a moral philosopher who spends so much time thinking about the moral quandaries that never makes a decision and never acts. And when it comes to artificial intelligence and robotics, I think we're in that role of the moral philosopher right now, trying to theorize potential applications and potential problems before we're anywhere near the really acute problems happening. And as a consequence, a lot of us are perhaps lagging behind in how we would like to develop autonomous systems and robotic systems, mindful that when we do, we're also going to do so within a framework of the rule of law where the decision to kill would always have a human in the loop. So to some extent, I just think we need to get on and do a bit of this before it will be possible to devise the best international framework and have a really coherent moral argument, because this is too abstract.
All right. Anyone care to respond?
Only on the AI part, less on the robots. But actually, my team now at the university is working on a comparison, because China, Russia, US, and another 3 states actually published a draft of their ethical guidelines for AI for the near future. And it's actually fascinating to see that each one of them has these 10 main bullet points, and they're pretty much the same. So we can find a consensus here. But this is on the ethical side of the guidelines, and I believe that when we look on the spending of billions of dollars of each one of them, there's a new ways now, as it was in space in the Cold War, of building AI capabilities. Billions of dollars are being spent in this war, or this race between mainly the Chinese and the Americans. And yes, one of the applications ended will be in robots, and then we will see them make their own decision, and we can take it to, different movies that you didn't mention yet that we saw them taking over. But we're still far away from that. But I believe that a lot of them, like DARPA and others, don't really know exactly where they want to go with it. But most of the planning now is for 5 years. And we will see a lot of interest in development there that we still don't know where it will go from now.
I think in the development of the artificial intelligence, and particularly the creation of the early algorithms that will have an impact on the battlefield, one of the things that I find troubling and acutely frustrating is the absence of the majority of mainstream computer scientists and software developers in getting stuck in. And by principally the approach of people who hold critical left positions, their absence from helping the military to understand artificial intelligence will result in, generally, worse computer scientists and less capable software developers writing the very algorithms that we want to be the least biased, the most effective. So by choosing not to come forward, a lot of these attitudes are more likely to bring about the very concern that is requiring them to stand back.
Yeah, we need philosophers that can write codes. We don't really have them. Even that it's pretty much the same discipline in the end of the day. So you suppose you need the humanitarian side to study computer science in some way. So maybe this is for academic world to start to integrate an interdisciplinary studies between computer science and ethical studies or philosophy studies.
Yeah, my first comment would be that in my environment, the sea, early and limited AI has already and is being used on what we call point defense systems, when if you've got a defensive system against a very fast missile that's coming towards you, actually by the time it's seen, detected, decision chain, when you're talking about seconds rather than minutes. So those systems already exist, but the parameters under which it triggers itself, the speed of the incoming target and all those things, it's pretty clear what it's going to hit. I'll go back to a sort of a slightly more sort of operation and strategic point on this. I think if we got into a war, an existential war of national existence, I think a lot of these will be put to one side fairly quickly. I think where AI and autonomy is, and I don't think this has really been articulated by people, where it's going to be most dangerous is in that confrontation, just short of war, very high tension, where the judgment applied to what everybody does needs to be really acute. And it's the sort of intelligence that AI, there are some things that at the moment AI can do much better than the human brain. Lots of noughts and ones, crunching the numbers, but actually spanning across a range of things and not winning a game of Chinese Go, but actually moving from that to tennis at the same time, which the human can do, but at the moment AI would struggle with, is actually the sort of judgment that you need. And therefore that period, between peace and warfare, where you need humans in the loop still, I think, we might not in years to come by, but I still think we do now, needs a lot of thought. And really, for the record out there is quite a lot of international law around that. We've touched upon it, kill chains and things like that. And I know from my last job, we had 3 lawyers and barristers. Every new bit of kit or equipment, they would scrutinise to make sure that we were, safe legally and internationally. And certainly most developed countries do that.
All right, before we wrap up, and we're going to give you the opportunity to ask 1 or 2 questions, what about nation states, or how should we organize this? Can the nation state protect us? The city of Budapest, perhaps? The EU, but you're going outside of the EU, so it's the UK then. The UK and the EU. Or should we organize it at different levels? Is it perhaps also societal resilience that needs to be organized throughout society? How does this affect it?
That's the worst question to go first on. I think one of the encouraging things we're seeing by there being a disconnect between, say, the American Office of the President and the opinions of many of the states is that there's a multi-level and multi-channel level of diplomacy going on between cities to cities. Say Los Angeles is building effectively a diplomatic service and creating overtures to other cities in Europe and elsewhere. So because of the level of interconnectedness and ease of telecommunications, it's such a great opportunity for there to be an empowerment of smaller and smaller entities, recognizing that the ability to mobilize resources will still sit at the nation-state level. There's I won't reference this television show for a variety of reasons, but there's a line in it where effectively what it comes down to is you need the ability to harness money and people with guns in order to have a lot of effect in the world, and you can't disconnect those abilities and still wish to protect democracy or project national interest.
Well, you can't get a Brit sat in front of you without quoting Churchill at some stage in the evening, can you? But I think it was Churchill who said there's only one thing worse than having allies, and that's not having allies. So, and I think what he's trying to I think what he's saying there, being part of alliances, whether it's internationally or intranationally, They need time and effort. People come with different agendas, different views. I think I've already touched upon it. If you live in the Baltics, you most probably have a different understanding of your security threats than if you sit in one of the Mediterranean sort of states of Europe. So people have them. But my whole career has been about being internationalist, and I'm a great believer in alliances of broadly like-minded people, because in the world that we live in, I think all of us are too small to really prevail on our own. And when I say prevail, I don't mean militarily, because I don't think there's any problem to which there is a purely military solution these days. It's that interconnectedness of the whole world, and there are other power blocks out there. So I think, absolutely working with allies is vital. But you need to also recognize that there is a downside to allies. I'm sure if there are two of you in the room and you're discussing which restaurant you're going to go to that night, can be resolved fairly quickly. If there's 28 of you in the room, you'll most probably be arguing and suddenly realized all the restaurants have closed. So, but that's just a factor that you've got to get over.
Tough question. I would say maybe a question. I have a question for you guys. If, as you mentioned, for example, on the diplomatic side, everybody can be today a diplomat. You don't need to be from a foreign service. You can be a celebrity. You can be from a civil society. Not necessarily a diplomat, because it's an international globalization world. The question will be, isn't security or our personal security, we still need to depend on our nation to secure it? Or there are other, like diplomats, other people that can take care of our security? I'm not sure, so I'm saying it as a question. I know that a lot of countries did find a way for collaboration between the civilian sector and the security side and law enforcement. And my country did it also. I have a couple of examples of that. I know that Hungary also did it after 2015 in some way. One of the ways to do it is by reserve army and so on, that everybody is part of something and protects each other. But I will say that still, in this kind of ways, it's still the institutions that we still look on them to protect us and provide us the security. But it's maybe a question in some way. It's not an answer.
I was trying to be helpful and polite rather than say something. Now feel compelled to. I think one of the benefits and virtues of the nation state is that it's one of the few identities to which people still believe in, that pulls us out of the types of echo chambers or really isolated communities that otherwise we're drawn into.
I expect I've said enough on this.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have some few minutes left for some Q&A. So if you have a question, we have a mic in the back, and there's a gentleman in front. Just state who you are and to whom you want to direct a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Samuel Carlo. I'm from the MCC. I'm a student there. And my question is to any guests who are willing to answer what do you think about weaponizing the space? And are there any developments in this field beyond improving the satellite technology? Thank you.
The space race.
Space is a vital, a global common now. The expression is a global common that is so fundamental to, almost everything that we do in our lives, from finding our way to the restaurant after this by Google Maps, and certainly a lot of military applications. And therefore, like everything else in the history of humankind, when there is something of huge value, it tends to become contested and competitive and everything else. And, it's almost within our nature that it will become whether we like it or not, or whether we mitigate against it or not, a contested environment. And it's fundamental, just looking at military activity for almost everything we do there, and looking around the world, people are looking at capabilities to find that advantage in space. So whatever we say, it's happening de facto, and it's the same as any other global common that is vital. It becomes contested.
I think the only thing from me on this is that I think it's space and possibly the Arctic or the Antarctic are the two international treaties that are imminently coming up for renegotiation. And obviously in the past they were done with sort of elite diplomats in agree on something. Now I suspect there'll be a level of national interest and private sector interest which could shift us away from an attitude toward the global commons. So if there are a couple of things that we can all do collectively, it's to learn and lobby quite hard on those two issues. Otherwise we could be trapped in the next treaty being one that makes space not only weaponized but heavily, heavily commercialized.
I think that the space weaponization was talked like 40 years ago as a war of the future. It turned out 20 years ago as actually a balloon. Nothing really happened there. Cyber, when we started to analyze threats in cyber, there was a lot of assumption that it will be exactly the same. It's like a buzzword. Everybody's now talking about the next war will be in space or cyber. Then we see private companies starting to sell products to defense from that, and a lot of officials will say this is the next threat. And actually in space we didn't see anything like it so far. Doesn't mean that it's not there. There's still a threat. We see the expanding of mainly from the civilian side, but also from the governmental side of more things that are surrounding us. But if we go back to the 80s and lasers and so on, it was only a buzzword part of the Cold War, and I don't believe that if I compare to other threats that we see today, this is the main one, or it needs to be prioritized.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have two more questions. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Paweł Pawlak, University of Warsaw. To anybody who will to answer. What about the future of conventional warfare? Will it be more bloody and more brutal, or more humanitarian? And how the usage of artificial intelligence will affect on that? Thank you.
The rather tragic thing I think about this type of warfare is that the poorest countries, so the global periphery, they'll continue to experience the greatest amount of death and destruction in addition to the type of informational cyber warfare. Whereas the more wealthy states with well-developed militaries will just experience cyber warfare and not the level of death and destruction.
Yeah, unfortunately, I got some bad news here that the notion, and if we're using war, the trouble is the term war is almost used for almost anything these days. We have a war on drugs, a war on famine. But if you're talking about warfare, it would be nice to think we could do it more clinically. It would be very nice to do that. But I said in my opening remarks, I just mentioned Aleppo there. Warfare has been, and it appears to be now, in a war amongst the people, bloody, visceral, and once you start submerging yourself in that, there is a part of the human condition that is willing to employ those means. So I don't, I don't hold up much hope that if we descend to that level, it will be any cleaner than it ever has been. And, the history of the last few years has shown me nothing to believe otherwise.
Completely agree with both of you. From one side, we still see the bloody wars, like in Syria and other places. But from the other side, when we look on the more developed countries, we see them developing more tools that will decrease the number of collateral damage, more precise weapon, meaning targeting the survivors and not the civilians that are surrounding there. But any friction, at least in the last couple of wars, is not somewhere in the desert between tanks of both sides. It's in cities with civilian population staying there or living there, so it will stay bloody in any way. So I'm not optimistic also.
Thank you. We have one last question. You can do the honors, sir.
Yeah, I'm Balint. And my question would be, first of all, to Vice Admiral Duncan or to any other of the gentlemen who would like to answer. You mentioned that state control of propaganda has been loosening throughout the last 20 years. Well, my question would be about China and their use of propaganda over the Hong Kong protests and how they managed to kind of subvert it and push it down from other parts of China, from becoming it very popular. If China can implement this, wouldn't you think that other states can implement it as well?
China has done it. It is a state that is centrally controlled. It doesn't hold, from what I observe, to the sort of fundamental freedoms of the individual that we do. So other states can do it. But I go back to almost the first point that Oliver said, you know, going back to the coup in our country, our state institutions, and the freedom of the press, which you know, is often talked about, actually sometimes frustrates our politicians, sometimes frustrates, you know, the citizenry as well. But that ability to look in, call things out, hold people to account, is not something, you know, those universal declaration of human rights that is meant to apply globally. Actually, there's almost a minority of people in the world to which that applies. So, you know, state-sponsored manipulation, propaganda, filtering out, not allowing, you know, various social media platforms to operate there, you know, is alive and well. But it's not something I'd like to see in my society.
I think it's one of the things that say Tim Berners-Lee, the so-called creator of the internet, and many of his colleagues so lament, is that this technology, which was established as another global commons akin to space, is now being very effectively regionalized and used as both a suppressive tool and as a very effective propaganda tool. And we're ending up with this trajectory that will have a broadly free internet, akin to a broadly free press, and then a deeply controlled and rather scary internet for many other countries.
I would say that you can't stop it. It's like water. Even if the Chinese Great Firewall try to stop people from communicate and coordinate demonstrations on the street, they can't do it by shutting down, for example, the internet. We saw it, I'll give you an example from Bangladesh a couple of years ago. They shut down completely the internet. What they did, people that had VPNs or download Tor, Facebook gave them a permission to do it by Tor, and then people started to communicate on chatting on Facebook by Tor. And after the demonstration stopped, because a lot of people were arrested on the streets, this is a way to do so these days, not by stopping them on the online world. So the number of people in Bangladesh that were using Tor completely fell down afterwards. We saw that in Iran, these days, they stopped the internet, shut it down completely. Still people were rioting all around Iran. It didn't stop it because people are using anonymous tools and VPNs to communicate between them. So you can't stop it by the internet itself because people would find a way to communicate and coordinate.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have a question in the back. Yes, and the mic. Perfect. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Yambo, professor from Kenya. My question is, what's the cost-benefit analysis of cybersecurity in business in the European Union, aspect to missions, objectives, or strategies and tactics. Because we find that, especially in Europe now, and especially in the Central Eastern European countries, many of the youngsters, especially in the universities, are very much interested in business with connectivity of excellent communication skills. So how can we help the youngsters? Because many of them are not interested in warfare, maybe in communication warfare. But here, my second question is the cost-benefit analysis of cybersecurity in entrepreneurology.
I think the Israeli model of success is in exactly that, is in cybersecurity. And what as a success came for building an ecosystem, funding of government to academic programs in collaboration with the private sector. I can give you an example on myself. I'm involved in research that combines between private sectors that sign with this NDA and share information, academics that work on this kind of project, and the funding comes mainly from the government or matching with the private sector. But this ecosystem starts in early age, in elementary school, when kids started to learn about cybersecurity, about cyber defense. Some of them later on will be drafted, it's mandatory, they will be drafted to the army, to technological units, to cyber units. And many of them will develop later on startups in cybersecurity. The number today is over 800 startups in cybersecurity. It's today the main export of Israel to the world is in cyber defense. Billions of dollars of companies like Checkpoint and others that creating firewalls, or companies like CyberArk that creating platforms like keeping your own information of the organization to yourself. And I think, again, the way to do it is by an ecosystem. And a lot of countries lack the understanding that this is the way to do so. It's not only government funding programs, it's a joint collaboration between academic, government, and private sector. And again, it needs to start very early, especially encouraging people to study science and computer science. But I will say maybe we need to take from this discussion that also philosophy and ethical studies are not only computer science.
I'm also quite optimistic about young people's resurgence of interest in business, not so much for that, but that what we're seeing, say, in Building Rebellion and hiring software developers, is the story tends to be, I left MIT or Stanford in computer science, I then went to X company in Silicon Valley, and I was a small part involved in a slight optimization of how quickly someone receives a food delivery. And then the next question you get is, would instead you like to come and work for the US Digital Service or the UK Government Digital Service and work on a much more meaningful topic? And then where we come in, we're able to say, not only are you going to work on a meaningful topic that could save lives, that could defend societies, but we'll also pay you a salary akin to what you would have in one of those Silicon Valley companies. So eventually there is a virtue where they can do effective public service, have a meaningful project, and make enough money to prosper.
Yeah, mindful of the time, just a short comment, and it was on your, I think your key thing about what is the cost benefit of cybersecurity. I think for my world, it's something you can't afford not to do, and it rather prompted my opening comment that militaries have usually started with, you know, what the Army wants, what the Navy wants, what the Air Force wants, and looked at the big chunks of kit. I would propose that you need to start with the effects that you want to create and the networks that are important to you, because everything now is interconnected. So there's no point in having a ship that is not on the right networks, that is not secured, because it's going to be the most, you know, the first and the easiest thing to take out. So cybersecurity is a fundamental building block. I mean, it's almost taking old Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Cybersecurity and looking after your networks are going to be like food, shelter, and warmth before you can go on and work out what it is you really want to achieve.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the second edition of the MCC Budapest Lectures on the future of warfare. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. And please give a hand again to our speakers, Daniel Cohen, Oliver Lewis, and Vice Admiral Duncan Potts. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the inspiring thoughts that had been shared, both for our speakers and the moderator. Our next event will take place on the 12th of December. Further information will be found on our website. Please subscribe to our mailing list, follow us on Twitter, Facebook. Hope you enjoyed your time. Please fill in the feedback forms which were packed in your welcome packs, return your interpreter devices, and throw your feedback forms at the exit when you leave. Stay tuned and have a good night.